Okay, so today I have 5 Gamesense tips that'll help your understanding of Fortnite, and we'll skip the intro completely. Let's just get right into it. Okay, so the first tip that I have for you guys is how to team fight properly, or how to play man advantages properly in Fortnite. And the funny thing that I noticed is that in CSGO, in League, in Valorant, in Overwatch, and all sorts of team games, people play man advantages really well, even at low ranks. It's a common understanding that people have. But for some reason in Fortnite, it just doesn't exist. I don't know why, but people just have this solo mentality and just don't play team fights properly. They don't play with their team. And so this fight here is a perfect example of that. This fight sort of starts off as like a common thing that happens in Fortnite. It's a stalemate, right? People are just ARing each other from a distance. They're sort of stalemating for height, and then one team just decides to go for height. So the team that we're studying is the team on the left, right? This is a friendly team, and we'll assume the team on the right is the enemy team, right? And so Hockey and his team are about to go for height, right? And then it turns into an interesting situation where there's a 2v2 on the right and then a 1v1 on the left. And so if we play the fight out, you'll see Texi's going for height, goes for height, gets height, because these guys just don't contest it. It's like a very low level fight. I just don't think that these guys know what they're doing, but we'll use this as our noob example, right? Like what not to do. And if we realize that Hockey gets into a 1v1, just like I said, there's a 2v2 going on in here. These guys are on the same team, and if you see my mouse, these guys are on the same team. And so these guys are about to fight each other in a 1v1, which is okay. The biggest thing that happens is that Hockey gets a free kill. He knocks someone, wins his one, and immediately knocks someone right away. But the problem is, he must have calmed to his team, like, hey, I knocked someone. Obviously, like, people usually calm when they get a kill. But these guys need to take that as a indication, hey, it's a 3v2. If I just wait 10 to 15 seconds, this immediately is a one fight with a 3v2 man advantage, right? But for some reason, they get up close just because they get an HP advantage. They get up really close, play shotguns, and then lose the fight completely. But instead, obviously, there's some micro mistakes that happen here that cause them to lose the 2v2. But you don't need to take this risk. You don't need to take the case where like you have to play the fight perfectly. If you just wait 10 seconds for Koki to clean up his kill, get the finish, get his loot, and then come over to join you, you can 3v2 properly. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have to fight, right? It means that you just need to keep your distance, make sure you're not going to get boxed, and maybe like cone out this way, come to where the camera is, and start ARing them from this sort of distance, this sort of safe distance. That way you'll keep the pressure up so that this guy Maybach cannot heal, and then you're still fighting, but you're not fighting in a risky manner, right? Your goal is to wait for Koki reinforcements to come over and then turn it into a 3v2, and then at the same time you guys all get in and should be able to clean up. This fight is a completely landslide one fight for Koki and his team, but for some reason these two are just completely getting in. They just don't care about the fact that Koki's 10 seconds he gets over to help them. They just run in and try to fight 2v2, when literally if they just waited 10 seconds, this fight is a complete one fight. So the advice that I have, the tip, is to just basically understand, hey, there's man advantages in Fortnite. If you get a kill, or if you sort of have a man advantage because of the fact that the enemy team is split and you guys are together, really abuse that. It's just insane. It's just really good how much of an advantage you can get just from the fact that you're playing with your team and you have one more shotgun compared to the enemy. Okay, so the second tip that I have for you guys is understanding gun swap delay. This is a fundamental of Fortnite, and people don't really respect it or appreciate it enough, and they end up putting themselves in situations. Beginners, intermediates, pro players even, they tend to make situations where they do edits like this, and it's like you're making a wide edit or an edit like this, and then you're just making a wide edit, right? And you're not creating a peak for yourself. Something like this is a peak. Something like this is a peak, right? Something like that is really advantageous, because what's actually happening is when you do something like this, you're putting yourself behind cover while you're pulling out your gun. Notice when I make an edit, I have to pull my gun out. There's a delay there. I can't just shoot right away, right? There's a delay, that delay, right? And so what's happening is when you do this peak, you're creating yourself a cover to sit behind while you pull out that gun, right? So if you do it full motion, you're pulling out your gun, but you're doing it behind cover. Same with the window, pulling out your gun, but doing it while out of sight. And so that seems really obvious because people are really used to peanut butters and windows, and they know how to right hand peek. This is the situation. Let's put ourselves in this situation, right? Where there's an enemy standing literally where I'm shooting right now, and a lot of people would do this, right? And then they'll like hide behind this corner, or like just like walk too late. The problem is you doing this walk is really telegraphed. It's really telegraphed, right? And so it's kind of obvious what you're doing, and then they'll just most likely reset, or they'll predict what you're doing and try to take the wall or something of that nature. It's too slow. So what Noah really does in general is the fact that he does this edit. right? And puts himself in a situation where he has cover for sure, and he can jump shot. This is a left-hand peek, but he can jump shot, and it's still a really good advantageous situation because of that jump shot situation, right? The general rule of thumb to follow is that if there's an enemy to your right, you want to sort of edit towards the left, create an opening on the left, and then you can use this as cover and then do this. Even an edit like this is way more advantageous than doing something like this and then being exposed, right? Because the guy's standing right here, you can see yourself. And so you either have to go all the way in the corner before you edit this, or just make an edit like to the left hand and then make a jump shot like that, right? Something that Noah really does a lot, actually, really consistently, and it just shows like how much he knows what gun swap delay is and how much he respects it, and like what he sort of does to make sure it never happens to him. Because the biggest thing that players do is they have the edit, they have the wall, but they're putting themselves at the disadvantage, which clearly doesn't make any sort of sense, right? You should never be putting yourself at the disadvantage if you took the trouble to get that wall. So the guy who's standing like all the way out here is just looking at you and just like doing nothing, he's doing no work, and he's just looking at you and just shoots, and he just gets a lot of damage. And so if you're the guy in the box, please understand like the concept of right hand peeks, but also the concept of just having cover when you're pulling out your gun. Make sure you're not in a position, and this goes for movement as well, right? So a lot of people make right hand edits and they do this and they think they have a right hand peek. You don't have a right hand peek. I mean, you do, you have some cover, but you're completely exposed, right? So when you're making the edit, you have to pull out that gun, and the guy right here is just not going to react that slow. He's just going to shoot you and then flip the cone and run away, right? So like, this is the biggest thing I personally think that loses people fights. They put themselves in situations where their gun swap delay allows them to get shot. You're losing trades or losing a lot of fights because of gun swap delay. And the way to fix that is just really make sure, let's say your enemy's standing right here, right here. So if you think about a grid system, if the enemy's standing on these two tiles, do not select these two tiles. Do not make an opening like this, because he can see you completely, right? There's no cover at all. And so if you do something like this and he's standing right here and then you jump shot him like that, that is way better. That is a better peek than doing something on a right hand basis. And that's why you see sometimes where Noah really does a situation like this and tries to peek someone like this, right? Because it's a way better peek than doing this and getting shot on your way to get in this corner to right hand peek someone, right? So just understand that concept, and it should help you guys a lot. Okay, so the third tip that I have for you guys is basically practicing with intent and doing stuff for the sake of practicing. What does practicing with intent mean? It basically means like you're doing something for the sake of actually practicing, right? You're not going in autopilot. You're not just blankly doing the motion just to do the motion. So for example, if you're practicing 90s, you're not just doing 90s. You're sort of there. You're in the moment. You're practicing, and you also sort of understand you're doing this for a reason, right? Not only are you doing this for like tournaments in the future, but like later on when you're going for height in endgame, because you're second height, you're tarping and you're sort of elevated, but you realize height's like sort of falling behind, but you need to crank. You practice these 90s because you realize later on in sort of an endgame you're gonna need to crank for height. And so I looked up a bunch of like motor learning literature online to look for an actual example on this to prove this concept. And there's something called the intention superiority effect, all right? And this effect, when you have an intention to do something in the future, it changes the actual way your brain behaves and takes in that practice, right? And so this study in 2006, it asked a bunch of volunteers to learn a skill, and it relates to motor learning, right? Which is basically what Fortnite is. And the skill was a sequence of key presses, right? There's two groups, right? You can see where this is going, probably. They basically had to determine whether a line that they saw on the screen was something that they practiced in the past or not. And so the only difference between the two groups was that group A was told that they would be tested on all these practice in literally 10 minutes, right? So they would need to remember all these things. Group B was not told anything at all, right? What they found was that there was a tremendous difference between both groups. Group A was significantly better on both the learning aspect, but also the patterns later. So when they were tested and they were asked to remember all these patterns, they remembered it significantly better than Group B. They did a much better job. And so how this applies to Fortnite is like when you're practicing tunneling, when you're scrimming, when you're VOD reviewing, you need to understand that you're not just doing this to like sort of go over the practice over and over and over and over and over. You're doing this for a reason, right? If you want to win that solo cash cup or do better in general or place in the money, or you want to do well in trio cash cup or do well in FNCS, you need to practice with intent. And the biggest thing that I notice in the community is that people play scrims all the time and they play them on autopilot. They just play them to play them. They just go through 6 games a day and they just don't they just don't, they're not there. Like, they're just practicing to practice, and they're not actually trying to win or actively looking for ways to get better because they've done it so much. It's usually some form of burnout. They played scrims so much that they play the next scrim, and then they play the next scrim, and then the next day comes, and then they play another 6 scrims, and the next day comes and play another 6 scrims. But they're not taking each scrim seriously, and they're not, you know, really focusing on each aspect of that scrim. And what that does is that you're autopiloting. You're not actually learning that much at all. And so the way you can fix that is to really be present in the moment, understand what you're doing, understand the reason why you're scrimming. You're scrimming so that you can do better in the tournament. That has a direct effect on your performance in the tournament, and this will naturally help your practices. This goes for arena, this goes for creative, this goes for anything that has to do with skill, right? This goes outside of Fortnite as well. So try that, it'll help. And yeah. Okay, so let's talk about something relevant to the meta currently, which is related to launchpads. Everyone needs to think of launchpads as a way to save your mats, right? It's like a 300 mat coupon, right? Save 300 mats. And so the biggest thing to understand once you reach endgame is that this coupon goes down in value because these moving zones goes smaller and smaller in distance, right? And so it's much better to use these launchpads as early as possible, and in general just use them in first moving. A lot of people see a free rotate and use 400, 500, 600 mats to get across first moving, and they're like, oh, I'm safe, this is better. And they're too scared to launchpad because they're worried about getting beamed out of the air. Relatively, I think there's ways to avoid getting beamed out of the air, so there should be a different way that you get rid of that problem. But in general, try to use your launchpad in first moving and get rid of it, because if you try to use it in second moving, third moving, fourth moving, it's way too compact, the zone, and there's way too many builds everywhere, and in general you're saving less mats even if you do it successfully. Your coupon now becomes a 200 mat coupon, right? So you're actually losing out. And so the one thing in endgame that people don't really understand is that mats, your mat count as a trio or as a solo, is becoming more and more valuable as you go on into the game. So if you have 2 launch pads, the way to do this is to just launch pad across, you know, halfway point, halfway across first moving, wait there, wait for zone to get ahead a little bit, you're back in zone now, and now use another launch pad to sort of save mats again and land in the end zone of first moving. And then now you have a ridiculous amount of mats, no impact by the way, you did not kill anyone. You have a lot of mats to spend across the next 2 movings, and you're doing sort of max distance launch pads, which gives max value launch pads. You're using the launch pad in the most valuable way possible, and if you sort of delay that and use them later on in third or fourth moving, it just gets really difficult to use them, right? And in general, there's not a lot of space, but also you're not getting a lot of value out of the launch pad. You're not able to glide the full distance, and so that's the tip. Like, just use launch pads in a better way. Try to focus on using them in first moving, which I found is the most optimal time to use launch pads in general, right? So the 5th and final tip that I want to talk about is VOD reviews. And so I put them in 2 categories, right? There's self VOD reviews, and then there's pro VOD reviews. And so self VOD reviews is something that you do like after a solo cash cup you played. You want to watch yourself back, and you want to identify all the mistakes that you did. Why did I get 10th instead of getting top 2? Why did I lose this fight? How should I have done this rotate better? These are questions that you can ask and sort of understand, and some questions you might just know the answer to right away. You'd be like, oh, I should have just done this, it's very obvious to me. But there's some questions, I guarantee you, no matter how good you are at the game, there'll be some questions like, what should I have actually done here? I really don't know. I don't know in this situation. This is really difficult to understand. Even the answer that you might come up with is not like something that you have full confidence in. And so the way to solve that is to go to a pro VOD review, and with your questions, right? Like, oh, what should I have done in this situation? Go to a pro VOD review, watch a similar situation that they've done, and learn from them, because most likely the pros have done something in terms of like that sort of rotate, and they do it correctly, right? And you can definitely find that on Twitch. You can find it on YouTube. There's a ton of highlights on YouTube in terms of trio VODs, in terms of solo VODs. There's just so much content out there to not be pro VOD reviewing as a result of your questions that come from self VOD review. So definitely do this. I think it's a very important part of learning in Fortnite, and I think it's extremely important for a lot of people to not be doing. It's sincerely one of the most repeated advice things that people say on YouTube, that people say about learning games, learning any sort of skill. There's a reason why Beyonce watches her replays back. There's a reason why people like basketball players watch their replays back. It's just the best way to identify your weaknesses and also identify where your shortcomings are. Like, what are your mistakes, right? And then after you identify them, you can start working on them. There's no possible way you can start working on your mistakes if you don't even know what they are. Simple as that. If you guys have any sort of questions in terms of the video, in terms of the game, leave them in the comments below. I read every single one and I will totally get to yours. But for now, if you guys enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more content like this one, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.